I was like, okay, I was doing personal training. I was interested in exercise sports science. And I'm like, why can't I just start my own thing? So like literally the first like business thing I did was doing in-home personal training. I just made a Craigslist ad. And this was while I was at school. So I went to school in Wisconsin, but not in a different city, basically. And I was going to go back home to Milwaukee. And I was like, well, before I go home for the summer, this is just for the summer, like in between, like maybe my junior or senior year, I was like, I want to do personal training and I don't want to work at a gym. I want to like do my own thing. And I'm like, I'll just do a Craigslist ad. And someone like signed up and I was so flabbergasted. Like, they don't know me. They don't know anything about me. Like, I haven't even done much in this industry.
Welcome to another episode of The World's Most Interesting People. I'm super excited about our guest today. We got Justin Gordon calling from Los Angeles, California. How are we doing today, Justin?
I'm doing great.
Thanks for being here. So Justin is the Director of Marketing at Vitalize Venture Capital. He's a founding angel investor in that group of 300 angels. He's the founder of the Just Go Grind podcast, which Justin actually inspired me to start this podcast when we met out in LA. And he's also started a number of companies. So it's great to have you here.
Yeah, this is fun. I'm so excited about what we're doing. I'm glad you're actually starting this podcast. I think everyone should have a podcast. So
yeah, I mean, honestly, when Justin and I met, we were at the Brex WeFunder event in LA, and he was like, telling me about the podcast that he was starting. I told him I was hesitant to start one, and he kind of just pushed me over the edge. And here we are, a couple episodes deep, and just super fired up to be here with you.
I feel like I have that effect. I find a lot of value and like joy and satisfaction from getting people from like they're just this close to doing something and just being that extra little nudge to be able to do it. Because on the other side of that, there's just so much benefit from all these activities, whether it be starting a company, starting a podcast, like going harder on Twitter. Like there's just so many different things where I see the value of it. And luckily I'm fortunate to have a best friend who's like the same as me in terms of drive and like starting stuff. So I never have the hesitation. Like he'll be like, let's just do it. So I feel like that joy I have from getting you to do it is,
it was super contagious. I was definitely one of those people that were like, I was like right on the edge and I was like, just kind of planning. I recorded a couple episodes a year ago and then just fell through, and just having someone like you, who's just been in the podcast game, in the content game for all these years, to just be like, just start. It got me fired up. And so, again, just great to have you here today.
Man. Yeah, dude, it's been a journey for sure. I mean, if you think about the content stuff, this is 2022 now. We're recording this. Like, it's just been like 2013 I was blogging a bit more then, and kind of have gone through different mediums, video, written, obviously audio, and there's just every different platform, every different medium has benefits, and a lot of that ends up being, what are your goals for it? What can you do consistently? What are the things that you're really good at that you also enjoy doing? That's what the whole like zone of genius is. Like, what are you excellent at that you also like really love to do? And so finding that through content, you just figure out which ones are better than others. Like this, for me doing podcasting stuff, once I had done it for a while, I already knew I was going to be interested in it and just having these conversations. But once I did it for a while and then figured out like, okay, well, I can outsource any of the parts I don't want to do with like editing stuff, then it was like, oh, just do the fun stuff and like prep for guests and have these conversations. And then you can see the benefit in the back end with how you produce it, how you promote it, all of that just, whether you're starting a company, you want to use that to help your company, whether it be B2B or consumer company, you could interview your customers, like all that stuff. Like content, just you can see the future and how every company they say every person they say is a brand. And I see that with content, even be at a venture firm now, seeing how like Gail at our firm is forward thinking enough to see how the marketing content plays into a firm, especially younger firms that don't have a brand name. And you see other people doing the same thing. Like I just saw a job posting, I think it was for like Sierra Ventures, like head of like content. And I was like, oh, these like older firms are seeing like, we should probably do more on the marketing content side, because all these other firms, let's just say like Mac at a Rare Breed, he has like 68,000 Twitter followers. He has a brand that's being built, and he raised his first fund. He's going to have probably no problem raising a second fund. And that's built off of one, helping founders a lot, but two, the content. He's been in podcasts, he tweets a lot, like all that stuff contributes to your brand. And in the future, look at like these next generation coming up. Who are they going to go to? Like, yeah, there's the brand name they'll always kind of go to because that's so strong. But they find you through this content. They're like, wait, like I want to work with them because they're dope. Like that's just how content plays this game, which I love.
That's spot on. I saw a TikTok pretty recently about I think they call it the parasocial relationship, where you're sort of building this relationship with someone online when you haven't actually met them in real life. And I think, especially in the founder and venture game, founders build relationships with VCs that are constantly providing value for free and sort of sharing what they're seeing day to day. And then on the other side, I think VCs are starting to build relationships with founders, seeing the milestones that they're starting to hit. So you hit on a lot of great points there. You also mentioned the zone of genius. And so, kind of taking steps back in your personal journey, when did you sort of discover your zone of genius and then sort of double down on that?
It has been quite the journey, man. I think there's been a couple impacts. I mentioned my best friend because I mention him in pretty much every conversation I have. Having that person to kind of be a sounding board, you figure things out along the way. I think the second thing being just a voracious reader. Like I'm lucky enough to have read books back in college that impacted me. So like one of the first ones, like 4 Hour Work Week, Tim Ferriss. Like that opens your mind to different way of thinking, different way of operating, like just seeing the world in a different way, which I found very helpful. But even that then led to like 1,000 other books. Like if people are watching, you can see my bookshelf behind my shoulder, but there's like a stack of books on my table behind me. There's a stack of books in my bedroom. And that I think in terms of finding your zone of genius was like the starting point of having that. So you're expanding your mind and reading and, figuring out different things that you didn't know was possible. Because I grew up in Milwaukee. Like we weren't talking about startups in Milwaukee, to be clear. Like I no one was really doing that. But then you do that, and then also just that gave me kind of the confidence to just test different things out. So like after reading the 4 Hour Work Week in college, I was like, okay, I was doing personal training. I was interested in exercise, sports science, and I'm like, why can't I just start my own thing? So like literally the first like business thing I did was doing in-home personal training. I just made a Craigslist ad. And this was while I was at school. So I went to school in Wisconsin, but not in a different city, basically. And I was going to go back home to Milwaukee. And I was like, well, before I go home for the summer, this is just for the summer, like in between, like maybe my junior or senior year, I was like, I want to do personal training and I don't want to work at a gym. I want to like do my own thing. And I'm like, I'll just do a Craigslist ad. And someone like signed up and I was so flabbergasted. Like they don't know me. They don't know anything about me. Like I haven't even done much in this industry, but they signed up for the whole summer. And I told them like, I'm going to be gone at the end of the summer. Like we have like 12 weeks to work together. Like, cool. Went to their gym, like their apartment gym every week, whatever, and did that. So that showed me that, okay, you can start a business and like the opportunities are out there. And then the progression from that to just testing this whole content thing. And I started creating like, blogs around my experience at this gym called Fitness Quest 10. It was crazy because they were training like Drew Brees and like NFL players right alongside normal people. And I'm like, that's a whole different world. I was like, what is this world of entrepreneurship and like this different world outside of Wisconsin? And the progression from there, just testing different things out and seeing the results, that has gotten me to the point where I can figure out like what my zone of genius is. Because even back then, doing the personal training thing, I loved the conversations with clients and the mental game. I like the training, writing up workouts and stuff was like fun from a creative perspective. But the mental game of like, how do I get them to work out when they're not with me? How do I get them to do the right nutrition, all that stuff? Like that mental game was like fascinating to me. And then having those discussions led to eventually, oh, wait, I love talking to people in this capacity, strategizing, asking questions, being curious, start the podcast. There's so much to get into, but that's kind of how I figured out my zone of genius is just testing different things, reading different things.
There's a lot I want to dive into there. My journey also started with being a personal trainer. And I think a lot of us trainers have this in common where we look at sort of our goals as these attainable flags, but also we look at the steps on how we're sort of going to get there. And by coaching other people and sort of learning through others, but also learning through chasing our own goals, we're able to set those milestones along the way. And so, I think just hearing that, you started as a personal trainer, you set these goals for yourself, you actually accomplished them, and then you ran through them and took them to another level. I mean, it's really exciting and just impressive to hear.
Yeah, I mean, with that too, though, if you think about it, as long as you're willing to learn and test new things, and then you have the self-awareness, because I've been a big journaler for a while. Like I journal every night. I journal. I have this 1 line a day journal. So I've been doing it for almost 4 years in a row, and just literally like a paragraph that you kind of recap the day, whatever you want to put in there. But besides that, I have a paper journal I use, and I also have I have a digital journal. So I think that allows you to figure things out as well. So like in the personal training thing, I knew like, okay, the one little note, I like talking to people in that capacity and strategizing. That's like one note in the journal. But as you journal more and more every week and you figure out, okay, what are the patterns I'm seeing in my thinking and like how I view things. And like for me, the personal training side was, okay, I did that in 2013, maybe 2012 was the summer. 2013, worked at a gym until 2015, ended up leaving. And now, like that whole process, I figured out like, okay, you train like 30 clients a week, 35 clients a week. Okay, that level of impact, I realized very early on was like, I wanted more. Like I just thought that with my skill set and like ridiculous work ethic, I could do anything. So why would I settle for that? To me, it just wasn't big enough. I just thought like, okay, I can make a difference in those lives, which was great. That would be phenomenal. But also I was like, I could do more. So when I started blogging, in 2012, 2013, like that was, okay, I could reach an audience of anyone on the internet, which was kind of insane to me. I had online clients across the US, like a few of them as I was doing personal training. And I just figured out like that model of even online training combined with in-person, it wasn't big enough for me. Like I just didn't think it was like, okay, I saw the end game, put it this way. It was like, okay, what's the end game with that? Eventually I have a full like list of online clients, right? I could outsource it and build a company around, bring other trainers in to do the training. I could do the same thing with in-person training. I still thought that for me was like limiting in some way. And so once I figured that out through journaling and reading things, like you can't like put it back in the box. So once you figure out there's more, you're like, oh, well, I can't like go back now. And so like all of that is through journaling and talking to people and reading books and be like, oh, okay, so this is actually not what I want. I did this for 2-3 years of that, great, but then move on to something else. And that just like fuels you as you're kind of figuring things out and trying to decide what to do.
And
next.
so when you're journaling and you're doing these, these sort of one-liners, is that how you get inspiration for some of your tweets? Because you've built a really impressive following and a really loyal following on Twitter, where people are, you post these one-liners and people are eating them up.
Yeah, I mean there's so much to it. Like I think how I view social is kind of not unique, but it's really true to me, because if I look at like what I've been doing, even before I started a podcast, for instance, like I started a podcast in 2018, right before business school. I was already having those conversations with people about companies and super curious and asking questions. Podcast was kind of a natural thing. Twitter, a lot of like, I have around 8,000 followers, but even that compared to a bigger audience, like there's a level of depth there, because like people don't know on the back end, like I did probably dozens of serendipity calls. I call them 15-minute calls to people. I just open up my calendar with people randomly talk about anything. Could be VC, could be startups, could be literally anything. Like who else does that? I don't know people who do that. So that's like in my nature to want to kind of like help and support in that way. And so now with how I bring that to Twitter is I'm just thinking of, okay, so obviously I'm in a venture firm now. We invest in startups. So what would be helpful for people in some capacity, and asking questions around different things I think will be helpful for founders. I found over time, like, okay, wait, this actually gets a lot of engagement. People would DM me, be like, that was really useful for me. I had the same question. I was like, oh, okay. And then as your platform grows, you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't work if you have 20 followers, because they don't have the responses because you don't have a big enough audience. Now the audience is bigger. It's like, wait a minute, I can do that same stuff I thought about doing before, but I couldn't really pull off, where now I get enough founders and investors who have followed me, who are interested, and I have a relationship built, that now they respond and they interact, which then makes it more valuable for everyone else. I just think of that first in how I approach Twitter. And like some of the one-liners are just like, as I'm reading books and thinking about things, I'll just tweet it out. And most of that stuff, I think it was Naval or someone who posted around like, most of their tweets are for them. They're for themselves. So when I tweet a lot of that stuff out, if it's not like a question helping founders, it's like things that I want to remind myself of. And I'll tweet those one-liners out or whatever. And then like I don't do many threads, mostly just like these little tweets and like that stuff. Cause that's just, I think, useful for people, but also for me, the reminders. Like I look back at that stuff because I put that in like our
So what are some of the common trends you're seeing? You've talked to hundreds, if not thousands of founders. And so, what are if you had to boil it down to like maybe one to three questions, like what are those three questions that sort of come to mind that are really common throughout all the founders you hear from?
So questions in terms of what they are wondering about. For
exactly. Like what are they wondering about when they come to you? And
yeah. I mean, everything with early stage is pretty much the same. They are fundraising, they are hiring, and they're trying to do customer acquisition or sales. Like those are kind of recurring topics. Like those were questions I did on Twitter for that exact reason. Like every founder is either figuring out, how do I fundraise for this company or get sales to do this bootstrapped? Like that is fundamental. The hiring piece, it's always a challenge, especially now with everything being remote or like a remote first world. Like you can hire from anywhere, which on the service level, you're like, oh, great, I can hire from anywhere. And then you're like, wait, everyone else can do the same. And then you're like, oh shit, like that competition is insane then when you have that level. So like everyone's trying to think about hiring. Because your team is everything, especially early stage, because we invest out of the fund at seed and out of the angel community at pre-seed. So at that early stage, I mean, those companies, those founders, they might have like 2 people on their team, like 5 people on their team, 10 people on their team. Like it's a pretty small team. So they're thinking about hiring. And then the last bit on that like kind of sales or acquisition point, like they're trying to figure out their go-to-market, their product market fit, all of that. And with that is like, how do we reach our customers? How are we going to find a way that either is unique or different in acquisition that's not simply Facebook ads, Instagram ads, whatever, especially with us because we invest in B2B software. So it's not typically those acquisition channels in that same way. But it's like they're thinking about how they can be unique in that way. Like any unique distribution or ways to get the word out is interesting. So like when I see a company like Party Round, and I bring them up all the time, but like Jordy Hayes, I had him on my show twice now. I love what they're doing, kind of like make it easier to fundraise. They do these drops to bring essentially eyeballs to their product. Different drops that are useful and interesting, and like they have a whole process going about it. But that is a unique acquisition channel for them to bring people to Party Round, which like even me talking about this right now is because they are so insane. Those drops are just they're wild, they're different, they're whatever. And then people talk about it because it gets buzz. So like, do founders think about unique and interesting ways to acquire customers or ones that are cheaper to acquire customers? Like I think about that from like my marketing brain is always thinking about that stuff. So I try to like think about that with founders too. Even like yesterday, I had a call with a founder who like not in the space that we invest in, but we've kind of interacted on Twitter. I was like, let's chat. And we were just talking through like distribution and options for like getting him customers. Cause I think it's fun. And like, that's what every founder needs.
So what companies would you say you're most excited about? Which teams are you most excited about? I saw on your podcast, you had Alex Taub from Upstream. I've been to a bunch of his events. He's a, really, really great founder. But, in terms of the Vitalize portfolio and some of the work that some of the more recent founders that you guys have funded, what are you really excited about?
There's so many different, like, it's interesting because we see a lot of different founders in different companies. So like, okay, just to give an example. So with us investing at seed with Vitalize itself, that's obviously a different level than the pre-seed companies we see for Vitalize Angels. But those Vitalize Angels deals at pre-seed, the reason we bring them in is we also think they could be a fit for us at Vitalize for the fund. And so we do purposely, like, they are the same track, like B2B software, like future of work, that type of space. And so like what we see from that is a wide variety of companies. Like one company from the Vitalize portfolio for Fund 1 is the Mom Project, for instance. So finding different ways to kind of help moms in the workforce, hiring moms, et cetera. And they're just crushing it with what they're doing. I look at a company like Toucan, which is a little bit different, like a browser extension for learning languages that has a B2B component coming up. Like that is fascinating. Their tech is amazing. Like I have talked to Taylor now twice on different podcasts. I think that's kind of fascinating. At the earliest stages, like a company someone we just had on, so Alex from Open Access, they're using data to help storytelling. So like all these newsletter writers and people who have crazy data they're using to like tell stories or like communicate things, they make it easier to visualize all of that. Like I personally invested as one of the angel members in that company, and I'm like, oh, like I can see the applications. And then you think about it at that stage, like you're investing in companies that you think are going to be massive, right? Otherwise, you're typically not going to do it, or you have different expectations. Every angel has different expectations, but that's what you're trying to do, right? So those companies get me excited where it's like, oh, okay. I think I saw a tweet around like Eric or someone from, it might have been someone from Hustle Fund where like, they're thinking about like what does this look like if it works? And that's all you're thinking about as a VC, because these are outsized returns you're looking for. These are they're not they're venture scale, and there's these power laws, right? So what does it look like if it works, if everything plays out well? And like, that's what I kind of think about too. And I'm so new in this investing game, but like I'm learning from those people, Gail all the time at our firm. So there's so many different companies. And then to your point of the Just Go Grind podcast, like a lot of those are all over the place. They're not necessarily a fit for us at Vitalize. That's kind of like some just for fun, some that could be a fit for us. We had one of our early companies from Just Go Grind podcast. We actually invested out of the angel community, which is kind of crazy, a company called Balloon. But that podcast is like, I get to talk to anyone on that. So like Alex from Upstream, like that's just a fun, like this seems really interesting what he's doing, so many different things. And like you mentioned the show, you're like, oh yeah, I have like a Bored Ape, I have whatever. I'm like, who are you? It's so interesting and crazy. Like
yeah, he's really funny because at one of his events, I got to meet his dad, and his dad was like, "Yeah, I've had a couple apes, and I've had a couple. I guess maybe he had some punks, but he was like, yeah, I've been in the game for super long." And here I thought it was mostly gamers and people that kind of just um, you know heard about NFTs really early and such that were able to get them. But it seems that they're just kind of everywhere now, and it's just really exciting. Yeah.
Yeah. That world is just, I don't even know how to describe it. There's so much going on. Like, obviously there's a lot of BS, so you kind of have to wade through that. And I'm not super deep into the Web3 world, to be honest. But there's just so much going on, and like obviously I see it. I'm on Twitter a lot. If you're on
Yeah.
Twitter, you'll see everything. And I find it fascinating just because people are building they're finding different ways to build things in this space, and like which is just like you can't help but be excited about what's the
So jumping back to sort of the future of work, you mentioned Balloon. Tell us a little bit more about Balloon.
Yeah, so I mean, they're basically doing like anonymous kind of feedback and insights into companies. So like, definitely larger organizations. Obviously, doesn't work with small organizations. If you have a 5-person company, you have anonymous feedback. You're kind of figuring out probably who it is pretty quickly based on situations. But when you're talking about anonymous feedback on larger companies, I think that's a pretty interesting kind of use case when they need that to get actually be heard and have these voices, especially when you look at like diversity side of things as well. It's very important. So that's a company where Amanda, when she pitched, I think they already had a bunch of revenue, a decent amount of traction coming into that. I think they also had gone through Jason's launch accelerator as well. So that's something I knew from the podcast previously. And then she actually will be coming up on our show, Vitalize podcast, I think at some point soon. But that was a company where like, yeah, I had her come through that. I already had talked to her previously. And then for them coming into the angel community, it's kind of a fit where like they want to work with that. And that's kind of actually the interesting part of all of this we're finding. Like our angel community is very diverse in terms of everything. What one non-accredited versus accredited investors, we have a 50-50 mix of like non-accredits and accredits. And also whether it be race and gender, like it's a really diverse community. I think it's over like 60 or 70%, which is kind of crazy. And so people want the diversity on their cap table. Like they don't want the same people always on their cap table. And so having that, we're seeing founders come to us for that exact reason. They're like, and there's someone else recently who DM'd me. She's like, I'm trying to get more women on my cap table. Like, is this something Vitalize Angels is interested in? Like, potentially it wasn't the right fit for our thesis around future work. But we're seeing that more and more where founders want that. And because they want that, then you have a group like Vitalize Angels, which we offer that. And so it becomes interesting, which is again why
When you are assessing a team, what are you looking for in a founder? Because a lot of times I'll hear from founders that, like they love the idea, but they didn't invest. And a lot of times they're left in the dark about why a fund didn't invest. And so, what would you want to tell founders listening to this, as to the reasons why a VC might pass or the reasons why a VC might invest?
There's so much to it. You're thinking about a lot of things. Obviously, you're talking about directly the founders, but you're looking at the market itself. I just had I have a lot of tweets I read, but I just saw, I think it was Jared Tingle from Harlem Capital talking about his most successful investments. And the theme across it was big markets. Like the markets were frothy, essentially. So that made sense. For the founder side of it, like you'll hear a lot of different things around it. Like I'm so new in this game. I think what I've learned the most from this is like, you look at founders that look at all the actions they have to do within their company, right? One, you're trying to get to $1 billion company. Okay. What does that entail? So it's like break everything down. If you're trying to get to a company that size, can they hire people? That's like the one first thing. I would be like, okay, what if they haven't hired people? Are they convincing then? You're thinking about that. You're asking them questions like, are they convincing? Are they going to be able to hire people? Have they convinced their co-founders? How they get them on board? Okay. Was it that? How about their early hires? Depending on the stage, how they convince their early hires? Do they have an early hire from Apple or Google, let's say that they convinced to join them or something? And that's just one example, obviously, but like, how would they get the people on board to be able to do that? That's like one part of it because the hiring piece is so huge. Also, there's a fundraising piece of it. So it's super early stage and pre-seed. It's so hard to judge, obviously, at this stage, but like what have they done before previously that might be helpful for us in terms of the data point? And that's kind of what you're always looking at. All you have is just like data points that there's not always a lot of it, especially someone like very young, not very experienced. Like, how are you going to bet on that as someone who could pull it off? What they've been working on? How far have they gotten already with the product or the team itself at this early stage? And I say that because it's always tricky because, again, pre-seed versus seed is different. But what they've been able to already build and bring together in terms of team, in terms of product, in terms of how they're going about their fundraising, depending on where the process is with that. Like if they already have notable investors on, it's always interesting because it's like one, like what are they doing that's interesting enough to them, but also why they convince them or how they convince them. And it depends. Some people are repeat founders, some are first time founders. So it's hard to assess because every situation is so different. But do they have the ability to potentially hire people, sell the product? All of that kind of goes into it. And, for my mind and how I think about these things, just like asking questions and figuring out. It's like when we have our angel pitches every month where 3 to 5 companies pitch. And it's always just interesting to hear what people bring up from the questions perspective about the founders when they pitch. It's like they pitched our, the typical slide deck. People kind of have seen different versions of that online. But what questions do people ask to kind of tear it apart, especially when you have like, industry experts? Because a lot of times with this, it's future work, but what is the expertise within that? And people have questions that are just so relevant. And you're like, oh, like that. How do they answer them? Like, how does the founder respond to them? How in depth is their answer? I think I remember hearing a really good interview I did with Andrew Gluck from Irreverent. He had talked about how when he asked these questions of founders about like, what's your product roadmap or what's your distribution strategy, the level of depth in their responses is how you figure out if they're going to be able to do it or not. So if someone comes to you and he was doing consumer, but they're like, oh yeah, we're gonna run Facebook ads and Google ads and we'll adjust things there and we'll figure it out. Versus like, this is the budget we're gonna use. These are the tests we're gonna run. After 6 weeks, we're gonna figure. Like if they already have stuff mapped out from them when you ask the questions, that's just another data point that helps you decide on, okay, like is this the founder I want to invest in or not? And the thing about that is though, the one tricky part, which you're probably going to hear again, is like, if you know someone who could just pitch though, just a good salesperson, we see these stories on TV, right? Like Adam Newman at WeWork, whatever, these founders who are super charismatic, right? Like you see the founders that are super charismatic who convince people and they can raise capital because of that, because they have a massive vision and they just are charismatic. Like, are you falling for the trap of that? Like, I don't know the answer as to how you evaluate necessarily, but that's something we also look out for.
The Adam Newman book is one of the most interesting books that I've ever read. Like, I think just seeing how fast he was able to raise money and sort of, at certain points of the book, he talks about solving world hunger and, solving homelessness and such. And like, I think, when I read it, it was like, if they were able to get to that point, it'd be pretty amazing. But,
yeah,
I think on the other side of it, you see a lot of founders who might have a really strong plan, but aren't able to communicate effectively. And so like, I guess, how do you think people should really draw that balance when they,
that's interesting you mentioned that, because I had told someone that as well as a point to bring up around like, okay, when we have these pitches, for instance, like, was it a bad pitch because the founder was they're just bad at pitching, or like, are they going to be able to turn things around and pitch their company to others? Because if they can't pitch their company, how do they bring on employees? How do they bring on future funders? Like, you're always thinking about that, but they could just be like terrible at pitching and be just rock stars. Like, they're kick ass at building product and like they could do it. So it's like, it's hard to evaluate that. I don't have a clear answer for that, but I've tried to think.
I remember sitting in a pitch meeting once, and just over the last couple of years, I've done a lot of these startup competitions. So you see sort of an entire spectrum of founders. And I remember sitting in this one, I won't mention the name of the company, but this one founder comes in really soft spoken, really slow. I almost thought they were unprepared, but they weren't. They basically come in and say, hi, here's what we do. Here's our app. It's really cool. No one's paying attention. And then he goes, we have 98% retention. We've only had like a handful of cancellations, and all of a sudden the checkbook started coming out, and folks were really excited about it. And so, sometimes the flashiness, I've seen both sides. The flashiness works, but sometimes being not flashy works really well as well.
Well, that's the thing too. Like, if you have the numbers, you have the numbers, right? And I think another part of it, like to that exact point you're saying there, is like, it's the holistic part of investing in the company. Like, you're looking at like we just had. So we run due diligence workshops for our other angel investors, like in our community. And like, I just watched like one of them from Caroline that she led. And like, there's so many aspects of diligence we're going through. I mean, you talk about investing, it's like, obviously you're investing in the team, especially early on. When these early stages, you're investing in the team so heavily, but like, is the market big enough? Like, what's the background of everyone on their team? The distribution I mentioned, how's the product development? What's the product development roadmap? Like, there's just so many factors, which is, it's kind of maddening, but it's also fun in that way. We were like, when you just decide to invest in a company, you're like, oh wow, like, but there's like, and I think someone, I forget who it was exactly. They're like, there's always going to be red flags, or not red flags necessarily, but there'll always be things that they're lacking, right? They're never going to have like everything. So what are you living with that you think they can make up for that, or like overcome those barriers? Because there's going to be something, right? So you're just holistically look at them, know the things that like questions about, can you get comfortable enough with that or not? And then you decide to invest. But it is like, even at our stage, like our fund invests 500K to like 750. The angel community is holistically anywhere from like 50K to 150K, depending on the interest in the deal. So our angels can invest as little as 1,000. And like me deciding to invest 1,000 in a company, like I'm thinking a lot about it, but I'm also like, it's not that crazy. It's $1,000. The fund, like when I look at that, like invest 500K, it's different. Then look at these bigger funds who are investing like in Series A and Series B, and it's like, I wonder how they think about it too. When you have someone like, if I don't know if you've seen the Uber Super Pumps show, but they're talking about Google Ventures and like investing like 250 million or something. Like that's a pretty big decision. Now they have a lot of money, so it's smaller in scale, but it's still like the biggest investment they ever did. It was like, there's so many factors that go into it at that point. It's just
so Justin, for the listeners at home, what's one piece of advice that you would want people to take away from you?
It depends what they're doing, I guess which angle you want to take with that. I think in terms of career stuff, I'll go with following your curiosity, I think is maybe one of the best things that has been helpful for me. I mean, I went from, personal training to like an e-commerce company, deciding to get an MBA, which I never thought I'd go back to school, and then joining venture where I didn't really think I would join venture. I think in 2017, I probably didn't really know much about venture capital at all. 2018, I started to learn more as I started interviewing founders. 2019, I think I interviewed more VCs and was in business school. So I was taking classes on some venture stuff, but like I didn't know anything about it. So I think that curiosity side of it, like fueled by that in a career, is interesting. And I think the second part of that, and even that kind of applies to business as well. The second part of it, like the self-awareness piece, I think is maybe underutilized, not talked about enough. Only through trying things and then reflecting on them consistently do you actually figure out what you want. Like you can't do one over the other. You can't just journal and be like, and figure out your life, right? If you don't actually try things. Like, how do you know if you start a business or not? Well, I'm just going to write about it and continue to write about it and think about it, but you never actually dip your toes in or anything. Like, do you try to sell a product online? Can you try, like, you never know. So even like you starting a podcast, it's like you thought about starting the podcast, but now you're actually doing it and you learn 1,000 times faster, but you needed both things to figure out you wanted to start a podcast before doing it. So the combination of the curiosity with kind of that self-reflection, self-awareness piece, that for me has been most helpful for me personally. And so I can only speak to my experiences, but having seen that kind of play itself out across other people and their careers, I think is something that it's a good recipe for happiness, success, etc. Is those two things. And obviously there's varying levels that will help you figure out what you really want, but it's an ongoing basis of doing those things though. You can't reflect once. Like I can't journal one time and expect that, oh, I know everything now what I want to do. And when I'm 31, for instance, like, okay, what happens when I'm 35, 40, 45? Your life changes, circumstances change. And even this world of like, we're talking a little bit about crypto and Web3 stuff, like that changes like a day-to-day basis. Like if you just journal like a year ago, well, now, like who knows? You see like Kevin Rose launches NFTs. Like, okay, well, that's a new data point, a new thing. Like that didn't exist like what, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, whatever. Like this thing moves so fast. So you have to continually follow your curiosity, but also I think reflect repeatedly over and over.
It sounds like, what you're saying is it's finding yourself is an iterative process. Got to keep doing it,
Absolutely.
Day in and day out, year in after year. And that's great. That's great advice. What's, as we come to an end here, The last question that I ask everyone is, what's one word that you would use to describe yourself?
If you want the word that first came to my mind, because I'm reading I just read the book.
It's my favorite. It's my favorite book.
That one just came.
It's such a good book.
It's so good, man. Tim Grover, trained Michael Jordan, Kobe, all these other people. I think that comes to mind because I've been trying to think about that. It's like I embody that, and I think that that would be a word I would use. It's hard to like pick because that's like the first one that comes to mind. I think the reason being is like I think about even like if you look at someone just like on the internet you've never met, right? You don't really know much about them until you dive deeper, have conversations with them. In even that, like you're not with them all the time, right? So you don't know the depth of their desires and stuff. And like, example, I talked to someone, like if you someone who seems unassuming on the surface, who you're like, oh, there's just some soft spoken whatever person, like what are they doing? But if you talk to them, you might find the depth of it. For me, like I, I'm getting up at like 3 a.m. most days. Like I work a lot because I want to, but like that's also tied to like what your ambitions and everything. And like I constantly work towards the stuff I'm trying to go after. Like there's just like, and I mix in like seeing friends and doing that stuff too. But when I really think about like, I've had these discussions with my best friend, like we talk all the time because he lives 2 blocks away from me. And it's like, if you actually do enough reflection and figure that out, what you want and who you are, and you kind of block out the noise around you, around like even stuff right now, people, I was thinking about recently how when did like hard work and working hard become so controversial? Like you can't even talk about it and people get so pissed about anything. And like for me, like part of me deep down when I hear that is like there's less competition for working hard now because people like want to take breaks and chill. You know what I mean? Like that's just like how I think. So that's why I think relentless is like the word I'd probably use.
Well, thanks for being here, Justin. This has been great. That was a great way to wrap things up. And so for the people that are new to Justin Gordon, where can they follow you and where can they stay in touch with you?
Yeah, I mean, Twitter's probably the easiest point. Justin Gordon 212. I have that name because 212. That's the like point in terms of boiling the extra degree to boil hot water. So like that's if it shows that if you go the extra degree, it matters versus being hot water versus being steam. You can power a steam engine. So that Justin Gordon 212 is my handle. That's kind of where everything happens from there. To give a little rundown, so from Twitter, we have a newsletter at Vitalize called Revitalize. We have an angel community called Vitalize Angels. There's a lot of other things happening too. But
awesome. Thanks for coming on today, Justin. All right.
I appreciate it. It was a lot of fun, man. Boom.